Welcome back to Vivid Noise, and today I want to talk about this little MS-DOS game called Charlie the Duck. While playing it for the brief period of time that I did, I came up with 3 things I want to talk about for this video. The first of which relates to the game's identity, or I guess lack thereof. You can clearly tell just by looking at the footage that this is a blatant Mario clone, and the people who made it are no strangers to this. They also have this game called Mario and Luigi and Super Angelo, which I actually played quite a bit as a kid in like a Flash game variant. It's pretty clear that Charlie the Duck, as well as the other games I mentioned, exist purely to fill that hole in the MS-DOS market for 2D platformers that are basically just Mario, but for people who don't have a Super Nintendo. That's not to say that Charlie here is a straight ripoff. You can already tell that the game is a little bit different in its, well, obviously its visual sensibilities are totally different. The sprite work is actually very nice. Charlie can also swim on top of the water because, you know, he's a duck, and he can use certain bodies of water as makeshift warp zones where you can go and collect more goodies. The first point that I wanted to make relates directly to that fine line between plagiarism and actually having a bit of an identity. The reason why I feel Charlie the Duck has held up a lot better than something like Super Angelo or Mario and Luigi is precisely because it's very clearly a ripoff of Mario, but still has enough of its own to not feel dirty when you play it, I guess. I don't know if it's just me, but every time I play a game that is unapologetically, blatantly ripping off something else and maybe just doesn't do it as well, I feel like I'm playing some like weird bootleg, even if it isn't technically a bootleg by your standard definition. Especially today with how readily accessible pretty much every game ever made is, be it through legal or not so legal means, it feels a little bit pointless to play those kind of games. What's their value? Obviously their value back then would have been exactly what I mentioned earlier about how if you didn't have the necessary system to play it, then you could just play the bootleg, sort of. It's not really a bootleg, but the game that obviously rips it off and get a similar experience. But the fact that Charlie the Duck has a little bit more of its own gives it a charm that you wouldn't really have if you were blatantly ripping something off. And as a result, the game is still, you know, fun to play even today. It feels good. I wish I had some music though. I've edited in my own music for this, obviously, but still. I should also note that the game's sequel, Charlie the Duck 2, released in I think 2001, actually has a very different approach to gameplay that truly separates it from what it used to be ripping off. Charlie 2, which you're going to see a little bit of in this video as well, has a more collectathon approach to gameplay. In fact, it literally requires you to have a certain amount of things collected before you can progress. Honestly, I'm not sure if I'm a huge fan of that decision because the levels can get pretty convoluted and sometimes the design can just be unpredictable but in a way that feels cheap. I don't know, I'm glad that the developers were experimenting with something different, but I feel like a more straightforward platformer still worked well. They could have simply introduced some more different mechanics to set it apart. Like for example, actually getting to float a little bit in the air. You know, you can't fly obviously, but still just a little hover, or maybe using your beak to break blocks, or just something, you know, that utilizes the fact that you're playing as a duck. As this is an MS-DOS game, it goes about saying that it has a shareware release. And this is the second thing I want to talk about, and that's to do with the amount of content present in game demos and how developers sort of choose essentially how much to give away. There's a couple pretty blatant contributing factors, so one of which is the era in which the game was released, which would obviously alter people's expectations and accessibility to a certain game. You know how back then the internet was a lot slower, so they had to put them on maybe discs or even floppy disks, which would dictate how much content they were able to put on the disc to begin with. And then there's obviously the expense of making the game in the first place. So even for 96, it's pretty clear that a game like Charlie the Duck would not have been a major budget release. In fact, the entire game I think is only $5 now, so it's almost pointless to even bother with the shareware demo. You can just get the whole game. It's really cheap. But still, the fact that both the shareware demo for the first and second game offer as much content as they do is proof that the developers weren't exactly losing much by giving it away. You've probably noticed that demos for more contemporary and way more expensive games are significantly shorter, and it's pretty clear why, because they don't want to be giving away potentially millions of dollars worth of game development. Speaking of which, I'm genuinely surprised that a game like Tekken 8 has a demo at all. I mean, it has 4 characters in it in a bunch of different locations, and I can guarantee you just one of those characters animating, modeling, sketching, dressing them, you know, designing their clothes, voicing them in different languages, all of that must have been thousands, hundreds upon thousands, and yet they're giving away 4 of them. To be honest, I feel like it's more of a flex on the developer's part because they know the game is going to sell well. It's Tekken. Although cost and time period I don't think are the only factors. There's also the psychological aspect. You want to be really careful with how much content you give away and how you contextualize it, because people might just feel satisfied satisfied with what they played for free and not even bother with the full game. A classic example of that is Doom. I already talked about this in my Mega Man X5 video, but yeah, John Carmack said that when people finished the Doom demo, they just considered themselves done with the game altogether, and I imagine maybe the same thing happened for Quake as well to a certain extent, because the Quake shareware version also offers a decent amount of stages. And if you want to talk about a content-filled demo, look at Unreal Tournament 2004. That has like 7 maps spread across a bunch of different game modes, and you still have full customization over the game match settings. I mean, you're getting a lot of bang for, again, no buck. Though I guess it makes sense, because really those kind of games, arena shooters, aren't too expensive to develop, at least when there's no, big stories or anything like Unreal Free. And at that point, the series was doing pretty well, so I'm sure that Epic knew that people would just buy it anyway. And speaking of which, a late RIP Unreal on every single digital distribution platform, because fuck Epic. Anyway, the last thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to Charlie the Duck is that it really made me appreciate the physics of Mario. When you think of a momentum-based platformer from the late 80s and early 90s, specifically the 90s, you instantly think Sonic. But after playing Charlie the Duck, which is obviously trying so hard to be Mario, less so with the sequel, but still, I realized just how important momentum is in this kind of game. When you've got such simple level design, you really can't afford to keep the controls too simple. And by controls, I don't mean having him do a bunch of different moves, but what I mean by that is that the character needs to have a complex relationship with the environment, as in the physics. They need to have some sort of weight to them. There needs to be a certain way that the character responds to player input and the way the environment interacts with him. So for example, in the Mario games, you've got all this inertia and moving forward, this weight when you jump and land on things. Those kind of things are subtle, but they lend themselves to some really great game feel and keep the game exciting and a little unpredictable. I believe that's one of the reasons that not a lot of people talk about that's allowed Mario 1 even. As primitive as it is, although still it's revolutionary, but it is quite primitive, and despite that, because of its momentum system, it's still very fun. It's so satisfying to get a clean run through the stage because you gotta keep that speed up with proper timing of your jumps and avoiding enemies. I must reiterate that the complexity of the movement needs to be in direct proportion with the complexity of the level design, hence why, for example, Mario 2, it doesn't quite have that same momentum. I mean, the characters slip and slide around still, but it's not the same as it used to be, but the level design is far more elaborate, so it keeps people engaged still, not to mention you have the throwing mechanic, so it's still a very fun game. I believe that relationship between the character controls and the world around them is what makes some people find the classic Sonic games a little bit difficult, because those games obviously have their famous momentum system, and yet the level design isn't compromised because of that. It's still very up and down and all around. And while that might seem that something like Knuckles Chaotix would actually be more accessible, well, the problem there is that it's boring, honestly. Like, I love the way that game looks, and it sounds gorgeous, but it is really boring, because yes, it has that trademark system that Sonic uses for the way the characters control, and they have a couple more extra abilities because there's a bunch of different characters, but the level design simply does not speak the same language as the classics, so it doesn't work. I never thought that some random shareware platformer from the 90s would get me thinking about the relationship between character controls and design, but here we are. I mean, you never know what you might learn. That's why I make these videos, to talk about the little observations that I've made while playing totally random games. And with that, I think it's time to end another episode of Vivid Noise. I've gotten all the points that I wanted to talk about out there, and let me know in the comments if you've ever had any experiences with these super unoriginal type games, or of any interesting game demos that distribute their content in a way that's a little different from the norm. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll see you guys next time.